They were never just tools of transport. They were lifelines thrown across some of the hardest ground on Earth. Machines that carried men, ammunition, hope, and sometimes the entire weight of a collapsing front. From the iconic Sherman tanks to the battered workhorses that kept armies moving, these were the vehicles of the Korean War. First came the light tanks. The M24 Chaffee was the first American armor to engage North Korean tanks in 1950. It was badly outmatched by the T-34S, but the truth is, it bought crucial time for the retreating UN forces when time was the one thing they no longer had. The M3 Stuart was already obsolete before Korea even began, yet it still served in reconnaissance roles, where its light weight and speed mattered more than its vulnerability to almost anything the North Koreans could field. Then came the M5A1 Stuart, used for screening and liaison duties while heavier tanks handled the real fighting. Its single radial engine gave it the mobility that kept it relevant, even in a secondary role. Then the medium tanks arrived, and with them came a harder answer. The M4A3E8 Sherman, the EZ-8, finally gave UN crews a fighting chance. Its high-velocity 76mm gun could stand up to North Korean T-34S after the disastrous opening weeks of the war. Beside it was the M4A3 105mm Sherman. Its howitzer made it the preferred choice for direct fire against the fortified hilltop positions that came to define the grinding static phase of the Korean War after the front stabilized. The M26 Pershing was rushed to Korea in 1950 for one reason above all others, to counter the T-34. Its 90mm gun could defeat any North Korean armor and ended the brief period of enemy tank dominance. Then came the M46 Patton. The mechanical improvements over the Pershing made it the preferred UN medium tank through most of the Korean War, especially on the peninsula's steep mountain terrain, where reliability and climbing power meant survival. British forces brought the A-27M Cromwell, though by then its combat role had largely been overtaken by newer designs. In Korea, it served mainly in artillery observation and liaison duties, where its speed still made it useful. On the other side stood the T-3476, the earlier version present among North Korean forces during the initial invasion. Its sloped armor and wide tracks gave it a clear edge over the light American tanks it first encountered. Then came the T-3485, the tank that nearly drove UN forces into the sea in 1950. Its 85mm gun outclassed everything the Americans initially fielded, and that fact forced a desperate response from Washington. When the war demanded even more armor, the heavy tanks entered the picture. The Centurion Mark III proved to many British crews that it was the finest tank of the Korean War. Its 84mm gun and reliable systems performed superbly in both the mobile and static phases of the conflict. The Churchill Mark VII, a heavily armored infantry tank, was used by British forces in Korea for direct assault support. Its thick plating could survive hits that would have finished lighter vehicles outright. The Churchill Crocodile, the flamethrower variant, had already proven what such a machine could do against fortified bunkers and tunnels when conventional weapons failed. And then there was the IS-2, Soviet supplied to North Korea. Its 122mm gun gave communist forces a heavy breakthrough capability that UN planners had to take seriously throughout the war. Beyond the tanks themselves came the tank destroyers and assault guns, the weapons built to kill armor or smash through resistance with brutal efficiency. The M10 Wolverine, used extensively in the European theater during World War II, had been valued for its speed, allowing it to engage and withdraw before heavier enemy armor could respond. But in Korea, the more formidable M36 Jackson stood out. Its 90mm gun made it the most capable American tank destroyer in the war, one of the few early UN weapons that could reliably penetrate the T-34 at combat range. North Korean forces also fielded the Su-76M, a light assault gun, whose mobility allowed it to support infantry advances across the varied terrain of the Korean peninsula. And more ominous still was the Su-100, supplied by the Soviet Union to communist forces. Its 100mm gun could defeat any UN armor fielded in Korea, and UN tank commanders respected that threat for good reason. Then came self-propelled artillery, and this is where the war's mechanical backbone became even more obvious. The M7 Priest, with its mobile 105mm howitzer, gave UN infantry the responsive fire support they desperately needed during the fluid battles of the first year. The M37 105mm howitzer introduced during the Korean War, brought better crew protection while still maintaining the anti-aircraft capability that ground commanders depended on. The M4155mm gun reached far behind the immediate front, giving UN commanders the ability to strike North Korean and Chinese positions well beyond the line of contact. The M41 155mm howitzer added another crucial advantage: the ability to displace quickly after firing. In Korea, that mattered enormously because Chinese counter-battery fire was a constant danger to any artillery position that stayed still for too long. The M43 8-inch howitzer was reserved for the hardest targets, the most heavily fortified North Korean and Chinese positions. Its massive shells were among the largest rounds fired by UN ground forces during the entire conflict. The M44 self-propelled howitzer, introduced toward the end of the Korean War, brought improved mobility and better crew protection to the 105mm artillery mission across the peninsula. And for Canadian and British Commonwealth artillery units, the Sexton remained a dependable tool throughout the war. This 25-pounder self-propelled gun delivered responsive fire support during both offensive and defensive operations. Communist forces also fielded their own powerful self-propelled guns. The ISU-122, provided to North Korean forces by the Soviet Union, gave communist armored units a formidable assault capability against UN defensive positions with its 122mm gun. Then came the ISU-152, another Soviet-supplied weapon, its 152mm howitzer, devastating against fortifications and ranking among the heaviest weapons fielded by either side. These were not just machines. They were moving guns, moving shields, moving answers to the brutal terrain and the brutal mathematics of war. But tanks and assault guns were only part of the story. What truly kept the war alive, what kept hills contested and front lines from collapsing, was the vast moving network behind them. Self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicles, half-tracks, armored carriers, armored cars, and amphibious machines did far more than fill the battlefield. They protected columns, rushed men forward, carried supplies through mud and mountains, and answered the kind of terrain that punished every mistake. Among the self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicles, the M15 combination gun motor carriage stood out with its mix of a 37mm cannon and two heavy machine guns. That combination gave Allied ground units protection against the low-level air attacks that once threatened supply columns during World War II. But really, in Korea, the lesson was the same. Mobility and layered firepower mattered. Then came the M16 multiple gun motor carriage. Its 450 caliber machine guns made it terrifying, not just against aircraft, but against Chinese infantry massing for night attacks. Ground commanders feared and respected it well beyond its intended anti-aircraft role. The M19 gun motor carriage added twin 40mm guns, making it effective against both aircraft and the dense concentrations of Chinese infantry that defined so many of the war's mass assault tactics. Then there was the M42 Duster, introduced late in the Korean War. Its twin 40mm guns were just as devastating against Chinese infantry attacks as they were against aircraft, and that made it one of the most feared ground support weapons on the battlefield. Then the war shifted into the world of armored personnel carriers and half-tracks, the machines that pushed infantry forward where ordinary transports simply failed. The M2 half-track served throughout the Korean War for reconnaissance and artillery towing. Its shorter frame and agility made it better suited to the narrow mountain roads that dominated the peninsula. The M3 half-track became the primary armored infantry carrier for UN forces throughout Korea, moving rifle squads across terrain wheeled vehicles often could not handle during the fluid first year of the war. The M5 half-track, supplied to allied nations fighting under the UN flag, offered welded armor construction that made it slightly more resistant to the small arms fire so common in infantry combat. The M9 half-track took on transport and supply duties, and what made it especially valuable was its commonality of parts with other half-track variants. In terrain as punishing as Korea, simpler maintenance could mean the difference between a vehicle moving and a vehicle abandoned. British and Commonwealth forces relied on the Universal Carrier, a low-profile tracked machine used for moving weapons teams and supplies through ground too narrow or too steep for larger vehicles. Then came the Windsor Carrier, serving Commonwealth forces in Korea, with improved capacity that better matched the sustained demands of the war. The M39 armored utility vehicle added another layer to this logistical chain. Its tank-derived running gear allowed it to keep pace with armor while carrying ammunition and supplies forward under fire during some of the war's fiercest armored engagements. Then the M75 armored personnel carrier appeared, introduced during the Korean War as one of the first purpose-built, fully tracked APCs. It marked something larger than itself, the beginning of a more modern armored infantry doctrine that the war helped accelerate. Communist forces also fielded their own carriers, the BTR-40, supplied by the Soviets to North Korean forces, gave infantry mobile protection during the rapid advance that nearly overran the entire peninsula in 1950. The BTR-152, a six-wheeled armored troop carrier developed in the early 1950s, served in transport roles across various motorized rifle units throughout the Cold War, and its presence reflected how quickly mechanized mobility was becoming essential on every side. Armored cars continued that same theme of speed, scouting, and survival. The M8 Greyhound served UN forces in advanced reconnaissance. Its speed allowed it to probe North Korean positions and pull back before heavier forces could trap it. The M20 armored utility car became a command and liaison vehicle for UN commanders. Its speed and radio capacity made it essential for coordinating the multinational force spread across the peninsula. British Commonwealth forces used the Daimler Dingo, a compact scout car whose small size let it enter terrain larger reconnaissance vehicles could not safely reach. On the communist side, the BA-64, supplied by the Soviets to North Korean forces, handled reconnaissance and liaison duties during the invasion and the operations that followed across the Korean peninsula. Then came the amphibious vehicles, and their role was nothing less than war-changing. The LVT-3 Bushmaster carried Marines from ship to shore during the Incheon landing, the operation that reversed the course of the Korean War. Its amphibious capability made it essential to MacArthur's bold strategic gamble. The LVT-4 pushed that concept further. Its rear ramp transformed how Marines came ashore at Incheon, allowing troops to exit onto the beach under fire without climbing over the sides of the vehicle. The LVT-A4, armed with a 75mm howitzer, provided direct fire support for the landing. Though, unlike the troop-carrying LVT variants, it did not carry infantry. The DUKW proved equally essential, moving supplies from ships to shore during amphibious operations, especially at Incheon, where conventional port facilities were unavailable or destroyed. The M29 Sea Otter added a different kind of flexibility. Its ability to cross rice paddies and river obstacles gave UN logistics units access to terrain that heavier tracked vehicles could not safely enter. The Ford GPA, the amphibious jeep, was used by UN forces for crossing the many rivers that cut across the Korean peninsula when bridging was unavailable or had already been destroyed. These vehicles may have looked less imposing than tanks, but the reality is they made operations possible where maps ended and improvisation began. And then the war moved into the world of tactical and utility vehicles, the machines that kept commanders connected and entire formations supplied. The Willys MB became the universal vehicle of UN ground forces in Korea. It moved commanders and supplies across terrain so rough that nothing wheeled should have survived it. The Ford GPW, functionally identical to the Willys version, was used interchangeably throughout the war. Its parts commonality made life easier for mechanics struggling to keep the force mobile. The Dodge WC series hauled ammunition, communications gear, and medical supplies across the peninsula's brutal terrain and climate. Then the Dodge M37 began replacing the wartime WC series during the conflict, serving as command vehicle, ambulance, and general cargo carrier for US and Allied forces. British Commonwealth forces brought in the Land Rover Series 1, newly introduced and well-suited to Korea's punishing operational conditions, thanks to its all-terrain ability and simple maintenance. The Austin K-2Y ambulance served British forces in evacuating casualties from forward positions, where every medical mission became a struggle against distance, terrain, and enemy fire. On the communist side, the GAZ-67, supplied by the Soviet Union to North Korean forces, became the equivalent of the American Jeep. Then, the GAZ-69, introduced during the Korean War period, served North Korean headquarters and supply units during the later stages of the conflict. Even motorcycles had their place in this war of broken roads and urgent messages. The Harley-Davidson WLA was used by U.S. military police and dispatch riders, its familiar engine sound becoming part of the rear areas and supply routes behind the lines. The Norton 16H served British Commonwealth dispatch riders in message and liaison duties, its simple design helping it survive Korea's harsh conditions. The BSA M20, another dependable British motorcycle, handled courier and patrol work with low maintenance demands that matched the austerity of the peninsula. And on the communist side, the M72, supplied by the Soviet Union to North Korean forces, served reconnaissance and liaison units with its heavy frame and sidecar option across the various phases of the war. These were not glamorous machines. Most were not famous. But really, that is exactly why they mattered. They crossed the narrow mountain roads, the shattered approaches, the wet fields, the frozen tracks. They kept units in contact, kept ammunition moving, carried the wounded back, and brought fresh troops forward. In a war fought as much against geography as against armies, that made them indispensable. And in the end, the Korean War was not sustained by tanks alone, or by artillery, or by the dramatic violence of amphibious landings. It was sustained by transport, by cargo, by engineering, by recovery, by the stubborn machines that kept armies alive when the terrain tried to kill momentum every single day. This was the final layer of the war's vehicle story. The trucks, tractors, recovery vehicles, bulldozers, and tracked support machines that turned survival into endurance. The transport and cargo trucks formed the logistical foundation of UN operations in Korea. The GMC CCKW 2.5 ton 6x6, the famous Deuce and a Half, carried the supplies that kept combat units fighting from Busan to the Yalu and back again. It was not glamorous, but the truth is, without it, entire offensives would have stalled where they stood. The M34 2.5 ton 6x6 appeared during the Korean War era as an early next-generation tactical truck, beginning the long process of replacing wartime designs in UN supply columns across the peninsula. Then came the M35 2.5 ton 6x6. Its multi-fuel engine and rugged construction made it ideal for Korean conditions, where fuel quality could vary wildly and roads ranged from paved highways to what felt more like mountain goat tracks than supply routes. The M135 2.5 ton 6x6 added an automatic transmission, reducing driver fatigue during the long runs that held the war together in every season. Older trucks still served as well. The Studebaker US 62.5 ton 6x6, originally built for World War II Lend-Lease, continued carrying supplies with various UN member forces. The Chevrolet G 506 1.5 ton 4x4 handled lighter cargo and communications duties, its smaller size allowing it to reach forward positions that larger trucks could not safely enter. The Diamond T 9684 ton 6x6 pulled heavy loads for artillery units, moving field guns and ammunition across the same difficult ground that shaped so much of the peninsula's fighting. The M54 5-ton 6x6 brought heavy payload capacity for bulk ammunition, engineering supplies, and the equipment needed to sustain major operations. British Commonwealth forces depended on their own trusted trucks. The Bedford QL carried supplies over roads that ranged from merely bad to nearly impossible. The Bedford OXD handled lighter supply runs closer to the front, where larger vehicles could present too large a target. The Morris C8, the quad, kept 25-pounder artillery mobile with its four-wheel drive, reaching terrain many standard trucks would never even attempt. The AEC Matador did the same for medium field guns, its pulling power making steep mountain roads less deadly to logistics. The Scammell Pioneer became essential to recovery units, hauling stranded tanks and artillery out of places where combat, weather, and terrain left them trapped. The Leyland Hippo carried bulk supplies through both the mobile and static phases, keeping rear area logistics alive when the front consumed everything sent forward. South Korean and Communist forces had their own workhorses as well. The Toyota KB served South Korean units in supply and liaison duties, and its familiarity to local drivers gave it an advantage inside a force expanding rapidly under pressure. The GAZ-AA supported North Korean supply columns with simple construction that allowed field repairs even after UN air attacks tore into transport routes. The GAZ-MM, an improved version of the Soviet cargo truck, continued hauling ammunition and supplies under the constant threat of air attack. The ZIS-151, supplied to North Korean and Chinese forces, brought six-wheel drive performance that mattered deeply in mud, snow, and the brutal winters that slowed all movement across Korea. Then there were the tracked utility, engineering, and battlefield support vehicles, the ones that reached places ordinary trucks never could. The M29 Weasel carried supplies across rice paddies and deep mud where wheeled vehicles simply failed during the wet seasons. It was a small machine, but in the wrong terrain, small machines become the only machines that matter. Recovery vehicles were just as vital. The M31 tank recovery vehicle had already shown its value in World War II, retrieving tanks disabled by enemy fire or terrain. The M32 tank recovery vehicle brought a distinctive A-frame crane that allowed UN crews in Korea to carry out battlefield repairs instead of losing days waiting for depot-level maintenance. Then came the M74 tank recovery vehicle, introduced during the Korean War specifically to handle the heavier tanks now appearing on the battlefield, a task the older M32 could not always manage. British armored units fielded their own recovery machines. The Centurion ARV recovered Centurion tanks from Korea's harsh terrain, helping preserve the operational strength that made the Centurion such an effective fighting vehicle. The Churchill ARV gave British crews the heavy chassis needed to extract vehicles too deeply bogged down or too badly damaged for lighter recovery units to reach. The Cromwell ARV, faster and more agile, could retrieve disabled vehicles quickly during more mobile operations. Long-distance movement of tanks required another answer entirely. The M25 tank transporter, the Dragon Wagon, carried tanks across Korea's road network so their tracks and mechanical systems would be saved for battle, not worn out on the journey to it. And then came the engineering machines, the steel hands that quite literally carved war roads into the land. The M4A3 Sherman bulldozer cleared roads blocked by landslides and debris, often under fire in forward areas where delay could be fatal. The Caterpillar D7 armored bulldozer built and maintained roads that Korean terrain was always trying to reclaim. The Caterpillar D8 armored bulldozer, the heaviest bulldozer in UN service in Korea, handled major engineering work, including airfield construction that helped sustain the air power advantage UN forces relied on throughout the war. Artillery tractors formed another silent but indispensable part of this system. The M4 high-speed tractor kept medium field guns moving during the fluid operations of both the advance to the Yalu and the retreat that followed. The M5 high-speed tractor supported heavier artillery batteries, where quick displacement after firing meant survival under Chinese counter-battery fire. The M6 high-speed tractor moved the largest 8-inch howitzers in UN service, delivering the heaviest ground fire available to commanders. The M8 high-speed tractor, more modern and tank-based, kept the heaviest guns moving through terrain wheeled prime movers could not manage. Communist forces depended on similar support vehicles of their own. The T-34T armored recovery vehicle allowed North Korean and Chinese units to retrieve damaged armor under fire, preserving tank strength during operations against UN defenses. The Ya-12 artillery tractor kept North Korean heavy guns moving during the offensive operations that drove UN forces back to the Busan perimeter in 1950. Then there were the Stalinets tractors, the S-65 and the improved S-80. Originally agricultural machines or derived from that world, they were turned into artillery haulers, dragging heavy guns through some of the worst ground on the peninsula. Through Korea's winters, through mud and snow, and conditions that pushed every piece of equipment to its limit, they kept communist artillery in motion. That is the real story of these vehicles. They were not just weapons, they were not just transport, they were the arteries of the war. They crossed mountains, riverbanks, frozen roads, rice paddies, shattered supply routes, and front lines that never stayed still for long. Some carried guns, some carried men, some carried fuel, shells, bridges, wounded soldiers, or broken tanks that had to be pulled back into the fight. But every one of them answered the same brutal question. How do you keep an army moving in one of the world's most unforgiving landscapes? If you have a vehicle from the Korean War that stands out to you most, leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy this kind of military history told with detail and weight, you can like and subscribe in your own way.